Hello and welcome everyone. Today is another podcast with Nilan, and we have a situation that is happening in China right now. So I would just move forward and start the conversation. I would ask Nilan the very first question, a controversial one. Will the Chinese ask their so-called research vessels, the ships, research ships, to show dock in Sri Lankan ports, and will that sit well with India? What do you think?
So the Chinese, I think, will certainly bring it up because they've certainly been very vocal that this is unfair. So I was actually in Shanghai last month, and the talk there was that number one, the United States does not want Diego Garcia surveillance over Diego Garcia compromised in any way. That's a tiny island way south of us. And the second is that the Indians
Isn't there
don't
a
really
UK naval base? Not per se. They're
technically a
both
UK
together. Yes,
naval
yes.
base, but they had an agreement, if I'm not mistaken, in 1966, where there was a defense agreement of some kind. And since then, there are allegations that the CIA uses Diego Garcia for all kinds of nefarious activities and all that. But once again, when we do the American episode, we can get into that. But Diego Garcia for the Americans and Sri Lanka for India, the Chinese see these two powers as the main sort of prohibitors of Chinese research vessels accessing these places because, as you know, most of today's technology is dual use. So many of these research vessels can legitimately be used for scientific and environmental research, and they can also be used for surveillance. So India's major concern is that in terms of monitoring India's military infrastructure buildup, in terms of monitoring naval assets like submarines and all that, that the Chinese will now have surveillance over all of this and that they will get to know Indian position. So the Chinese want us to lift the ban. They have said this repeatedly that they consider this to be an unfair ban. So I will not be surprised if they bring it up. And the Indians are not going to be happy if we do lift the ban, right? So this is the
When
first
was the
year.
ban set? When was this
The
ban?
ban was last year. It was a 1 year ban.
At the request of Indians, or we just decided ourselves?
We decided for ourselves, but wink, wink, right? So, obviously, these things, we are not going to do something to antagonize China like that without pressure from someone else, right? We're Sri
Mm.
Lanka, we're a tiny island nation. So, if this ban is lifted, yes, the Chinese will be happy and the Indians will be unhappy. If the ban stays, it will be the inverse that we see.
Well, Sri Lanka is caught between a rock and a hard place because India was the one who helped us to overcome the economic crisis more than any other nation or any other fund out there. So
Which
at
was the
that time,
reason why imposing that ban itself became a factor because by 2023, India was clearly the economic savior of Sri Lanka.
so how will that stand? I mean, if they ask AKD to lift the ban, what would you think his response will be?
So I honestly have no idea what the new government's foreign policy doctrine is. I don't think we've seen them at play enough for us to
Mm.
be able to say, okay, this is their foreign policy doctrine. This is their foreign policy vision. So, for
Mm.
instance, in India, he was very straightforward and forthcoming about the
Mm.
fact that Sri Lanka now considers India's security interests to be our security interests as well.
Yeah.
So now it depends on whether this position is maintained during the China visit, or are we going to go back on this during the China visit? That is what we need to wait and see, right? Are we going to keep our promise made to New Delhi, or are we now going to go back on that? And this is what will tell us what the new government's foreign policy doctrine is, because we've still not seen it put to the test.
So that
This
if
is
that happens, that means there's no policy,
if
right?
that
Whoever,
happens,
yeah.
if that happens, it means we go back to the old
Mm.
traditional Sri Lankan foreign policy of topsy turvy and
Mm.
using the term non-alignment as the mask to play this topsy-turvy game.
But in that case, how would we make China happy at the same time we make India happy? It's not doable as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I
It's
can't
not
see a way
doable.
around it.
It's
Yeah.
it's not doable, and often we try to make them both happy, and we end up making both unhappy. That's what happens most of the time. When countries try to
Mm.
make two large powers happy, they end up making both powers unhappy, because the large power is not thinking like the small power, and the small power is not thinking like the large power. As far as the United States is concerned, they genuinely feel that it's in our interest and in their interest if we ally with them. As far as China go, they genuinely feel that us being aligned with them is in our interest and in their interest as well. These are all big countries with decision making powers who are genuinely convinced that Sri Lanka aligning with them will be good for Sri Lanka as well.
Mm.
So nobody's actually going to be happy. You have the chance to make one person happy by picking a side. But if you can't pick a side, you lose that chance to make even that one person happy. And you end up making everybody hate you.
What do you mean by hate?
By hate, as in people are like, this entity is unreliable. And if there's a crisis, we
What
deal
are the
with that.
consequences? What are the consequences?
The consequences, as we discussed in the last conversation, was that when we had an economic crisis, we were essentially out there helpless at the mercy of everyone else. India had a stake in preventing us from collapsing for India's own reasons, not because we were going through a great prosperous period of Indo-Sri Lanka friendship, right? The Chinese initially refused to restructure the deal. And it was only after a lot of conversations and international pressure and them finding out that the IMF bailout package itself was going to be pushed back that there were lots of compromises made. So, and all of this is because we have no real power in the foreign policy spectrum, because none of them see us as long term partners because they know we flip flop. None of them know us as reliable partners because they know we play these topsy turvy games. So that's what I mean. You end up with no friends.
Okay, so the situation is quite grim when you say it like that.
The situation is very grim. I mean, Sri Lankan foreign policy. Look, think about it this way, right? No Sri Lankan foreign policy doctrine has been successfully transferred from one regime to another in Sri Lankan independent history. We've been around for what, 75, 80 years almost at this point,
Mm.
right? Whether it was the SLFP and the UNP back in the good old days of the 20th century, or all the recent presidents that you see now, we have never managed to have a foreign policy doctrine that survived the transfer of power. We've never had a set of foreign policy objectives that one regime was able to successfully hand over to the other regime. It's always nullification of what happened previously. So, of course, the situation is going to be grim. Of course, we are going to be in a very, very sort of sticky trap, if you will. And that's precisely what we find ourselves in now.
Uh, okay, so let's talk about this research vessel a little bit more. So we have Diego Garcia towards the southern side of Sri Lanka, the Indian Ocean, and we have India on top. So when this, why would they need a research vessel? Don't they have satellites to look down?
Yeah, they do, but in terms of but there are limits to what satellite imagery can provide you. There are, so in certain parts it's quite easy for you to. So for example, if we were part of the CIA and if we were running a counter-terrorism operation in Afghanistan, for instance, it's very easy for us to use satellite imagery if we know the coordinates to zoom in on everything, right? But countries have other measures to block that off. There are ways in which a country can evade traditional satellite imagery and all that. I mean, look at the way in which Hamas was able to train and drill for the October 7 attacks without Israeli intelligence being able to pick up on satellite imagery of mock towns being built in the Palestinian part of the area, right? So there are ways in which you can overcome it, and there are examples like the India Pokhran example we discussed earlier, where India's 97-98 Pokhran tests caught the world
Nuclear
completely by
tests.
surprise. The nuclear tests caught the world completely by surprise. So it's very important for countries, especially for large countries, to be able to hide their infrastructure build-up, their military infrastructure build-up, particularly the movements of assets like submarines and all that. So a satellite that you have in space cannot be relied upon to track the local submarine movements of a country in some localized part of the world. It's much easier to just send out spy vessels to capture that data for you.
Hmm. What's the danger or the risk to Americans by these vessels? Is there one, or just Chinese are targeting both America and India, or just
So the
India?
Americans are worried about Diego Garcia. They have that territory way, way down south, and they've said that certain Chinese spy vessels have crossed through Sri Lankan territory in order to spy on Diego Garcia. That's a claim made by the Americans. So even though the most of the pressure is from India regarding these docking in Sri Lanka, there's also been talks with the Americans who are not happy that Chinese what they call spy vessels have crossed through Sri Lankan territory to spy on Diego Garcia, which is why we are now working on SOPs, standard operating procedures, on what kind of vessels can be allowed to come in or not and all that, so that it's not just arbitrary, that there are certain standards that need to be met before authorization can be granted.
So what if China pushes this and we agree to allow in some ships that has a certain agreed upon SOP as well as a designated officer on board that are that are agreeable by both India and China, like a Sri
Yeah,
Lankan
so
officer.
if it's done as per the SOPs, I don't think the Indians will have a problem with it, because the Indians play a big role in designing those SOPs.
Hmm.
So as long as China agrees to adhere to those SOPs, I don't think there will be a problem. The question is how
Given that
fair.
they are very much honest in actually doing research.
Yeah, I mean, and once again, when you have a nation where the line between private and public is so thin, as with China, and where the line between public research and private research is so thin, it's very difficult for us to say who the legitimate ones are and who the
Hmm.
illegitimate ones are. As you rightly point out, there are many, many legitimate Chinese researchers as well,
Hmm.
some of whom are my colleagues. But at the same time, nations that are powers cannot help but look at this with suspicion because of that dual use issue. That's what this comes down to. It comes down to a basic technological issue, which
Hmm.
is that the same platform can be used for both a harmless and a harmful purpose. It's
Hmm.
like bringing a knife into a house where you say that you're just going to use it to cut vegetables, and I think you're going to use it to stab the people in the house. And both are possible with a knife.
What kind of research are they doing anyway? I mean, are they not just doing research? I suppose that they're not only doing research in the Indian Ocean, the Pacifics. I mean, there are a lot of other places that they could go research on. So if there's a if there's no foul play here, that means we can see Chinese vessels researching in other areas as well. This is just standard procedure. Is that's the case, or is it just the Indian Ocean that they're interested in?
No, no. So the Chinese do a lot of legitimate maritime research, so physical exploration research, where they try to map out the different levels of the seabed, what kind of resources are available, and all that. See, China is spending billions on maritime research, on actual academic and scientific maritime research as well. Nobody's
Hmm.
denying that. See, the
Hmm.
claim of the Indians and the Americans is not that China is using this only for spying.
Hmm.
The claim is that all of this can also be used for spying. So
Hmm.
typically, a research vessel might only have one or two spies, just
mm,
like how an embassy might only have one or two spies. It's not like the entire embassy is involved in espionage. You might have one or two people who are involved in that kind of work, and it will operate similarly in other field espionage and surveillance operations as well, where it's not like the whole ship is going to be a spy ship, but there are certain people on board who might be trained in that.
So in that case, isn't India doing their own research per se in other regions, maybe close to China? So that's something that
So
you're familiar with?
yeah, I mean, so basically, the point that India often brings up is that they completely respect China's position on this, and that they do not send research vessels into contested territory with other powers like this.
Mm.
So India's position is that they respect China's maritime concerns when it comes to research vessels and spy vessels and all that. Of course, with the Chinese and the Americans, it's a completely different story where you have bang bang accusations being thrown on either side. But once again, that is such an ocean, not just the literal ocean, it's an ocean of accusations, a metaphorical ocean of accusations as well, that obviously some will be true and some will be false.
So in that case, if India is not poking their nose near Chinese territory, that could be a plus point for us to argue against having a Chinese reserve vessel so close to Indian borders, Indian shores. Will
Yeah,
that work?
which is why we are creating those SOPs with India,
Mm,
the
mm,
standard operating procedures with India, so
mm.
that the regional people, the people here decide what the standards and procedures will be, and anyone coming in will have to adhere to those standards. So we are already kind of doing what you just mentioned.
So can you make an example of such a SOP? What does it contain?
So, for example, I'm sure it would contain things like the type of technology that you can have on board. There might be something where maybe for certain vessels an on-site inspection is allowed, because right now China will is very very tricky about on-site
Mm,
inspections and things like that. Even the recent Swiss-Russia cable cutting, whatever
mm,
underwater cables that have been cut and all that.
mm,
So there have been lots of sabotage issues like that all over the world. So
mm.
countries are typically very reluctant to allow their vessels to be searched by external powers. So it'll be basic security procedures like that.
All right. Okay. So we'll hope that we have discussed a couple of points where our delegates can use certain points to our advantage, just like the SOP situation, as well as India is respecting your territorial sovereignty, and you should do the same to us, something like that, something along the lines. Okay.
Yeah, but see, but from the Chinese person, and this is why it's so tricky. When we say that to the Chinese, they are not going to listen. Because from the Chinese perspective is, why don't you trust us? We are not here to spy on you. These are research vessels. It's so unfair that the Indians and the Americans are arm twisting poor old Sri Lanka to make them ban these harmless I mean, that's the basic Chinese. I'm not
Yeah.
exaggerating.
Yeah.
This is the
Yeah.
official Chinese position, that it
Mm.
is unfair for India and the United States to arm twist a small country like Sri Lanka into imposing this ban. So they don't see this as China infringing on Sri Lanka's sovereignty and all that. They see this as a completely harmless exercise which is unfairly demonized by India and the United States.
India and the United States. So they took it as a single entity.
I
They
mean,
take it as single.
The Chinese have made statements that both India and the United States have been putting pressure on Sri Lanka for this
Mm, 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 mm.
because of the Diego Garcia issue.
So they understand that we are being arm twisted. So can't they help us out by not sending one?
I mean, so they respected the ban. When we actually
Yeah.
put a ban, they said,
Mm,
yeah, we are not sending them anymore. So from
mm,
their end, they've been very professional about that.
mm. Okay. Okay. That's encouraging. And I believe we have given a signal that on certain issues that we take their side, especially on this Taiwan issue. That before AKD went, that they have publicly said for whatever reason that we accept Taiwan as a province of China. What do you think of that? What do you make of that?
I mean, so it's in one way I would say it's good because we get some sense of what our foreign policy and the new government's foreign policy doctrine is. Okay, so now we can put one bullet point. Okay, so Sri Lankan foreign policy is very pro China in terms of the one China mindset. We are not going to be swayed by the American argument against the one China mindset, right? Now, is this actually going to matter to the Americans or the Chinese or the Taiwanese what Sri Lanka thinks of the situation? No. Obviously, it's not going to matter to
Will
them.
that
It doesn't
affect in
matter.
some way the future Taiwanese and Sri Lankan relationship?
Maybe, but once again,
It's not that much, no. Anyway,
yeah,
we
yeah,
don't we don't directly deal with them.
no, no, certainly not compared to our dealings with China.
Mm.
So and to them as well, I don't think most Taiwanese would even know
Even yeah.
that the Sri Lankan president made such a statement. Many Taiwanese would not even know where we are on the map. So as a symbolic gesture, I think I don't see anything particularly wrong with that. If we were going ahead with a pro West strategic alignment policy, then it would be bad. But I don't think any of our foreign policy sort of, elites or the entire foreign policy establishment, I don't see that happening anytime soon, unless you have an explicit pro West political leader coming in. So in that sense, we're not really losing out much. The Indians are not going to be angry with us simply because we defend the one China position. So it doesn't do us any harm. It doesn't do us much good, but I guess it does a little bit of good.
Something like a green light, somewhat of a green light. But again,
Yeah,
the
I mean,
green light
see,
doesn't really matter.
for us to be able to give a green light, we need to be able to give a red light first, right? My green light to you only matters if the red light matters. So here, whatever our position is on the China-Taiwan issue, that is of no consequence whatsoever to the actual China-Taiwan issue.
What do you know about the delegation that went with AKD and what you have no idea? Okay. So, given that China has recently demonstrated their sixth generation fighter, so how would that? I mean, India is struggling with their air force. As far as I know, they have about 800 or so aircraft within about less than 20 or so divisions, or I would say fighter wings. Maybe I don't know exactly, but each fighter squadrons. So as far as I know, there are about 20 squadrons, and they want to go up to 30, and still they have about 800 or so fighter aircraft. But all those are fourth generation or maybe 4 point plus, because the highest spec one is Dassault Rafale, which is considered as a 4.5, fifth generation aircraft. But Chinese now has both fifth generation and sixth generation aircrafts per se. We don't know the exact capabilities of the sixth generation one. So given this scenario, if some conflict were to break out, what do you think the odds? Who do you think the odds are in favor of?
You mean if a war breaks out between India and China?
Maybe a show of force. I wouldn't say I wouldn't say war, but maybe a show of force. I think Chinese has the edge at this particular moment.
See, the thing is, it's kind of hard for us to judge until the two of them have both been seen in an actual war. See, India has actual military experience. You can name many, many different Indian military engagements, extra surgical strikes in other parts of the world, military evacuation operations in many parts of the world, anti piracy operations, anti terror operations, counter insurgency operations, and all that. With China, there's essentially nothing. Right. So China has a lot of heavy weaponry, but how well these things actually work now, for example, the
Since World War II, you mean? Since World War II.
Since the China-Vietnam engagement in 1979, that was the last real, the modern incarnation, the pro-West, pro-capitalist model that then boomed, and what we see as China today. Remember, China in 79 was vastly different from the China of today, right? So the China that we see today is essentially an untested military entity. So, yes, they do have a lot of advanced technology, but how will it actually work? Do they have the right doctrine for it to work? Does the public actually have the stomach for a war? These are all completely up for grabs. We can only hypothesize
Does
about this,
India?
right? Hmm?
Does India?
Well, I
Does
mean,
India have the same? I mean, what kind of experience do they have?
Numerous insurgencies in Kashmir, in the northeast, the Naxalite insurgency all over India, even coming down south to Andhra Pradesh, the brief kind of stay of the Sri Lankan Tamil insurgent movements there. India has had multiple wars with Pakistan, and India is one continuous entity which has actually transferred all this doctrine from regime to regime to regime to regime. India is not a country that's reinvented itself many times like China, right?
Oh,
So basically, India. Whether this is extraterritorial operations recently into Myanmar or anti-piracy operations off the Gulf of Aden in 2022, 2023, uh, the anti-piracy operations are a good example. The Chinese Navy is the largest navy in the world. They even have a base in Djibouti.
isn't
But
the U.S. Navy the largest?
no, in terms of sheer numbers, China is now the largest because China has many, many smaller ships as well. So technically, in terms of pure numbers, China is the largest. Of course, in terms of the most powerful, the U.S. Navy is the singular, largest maritime force that humanity has ever seen. But if we could just take the anti-piracy operations as an example, the largest navy in the world is China. China has a base in Djibouti, but when piracy became a problem, the Indian
Mm.
Navy, which is only a fraction of the Chinese Navy size, was far more active, successfully fighting the pirates and all that than the Chinese Navy. Right.
Oh.
So you can have the best technology in the world and all that. But look, the Americans went into Afghanistan and they came out after 20 years having achieved absolutely nothing. There's a limit to technology. What actually matters is where the battle is taking place, what the tactics are, what the grand strategies are, what is the resolve of the people, and so on. And in terms of all those metrics, China is completely untested.
Mm. Mm. Mm.
There are two military engagements that I can think of. One was a peacekeeping military operation in Africa. I'll get you the name. Maybe the name will come to me through the course of where major disaster for China, where many of the UN allies and UN peacekeeping forces accused the Chinese troops of abandoning their posts and running away,
Okay.
right? And then there was the big fight with India and China in the Galwan standoff where they fought with fists and kicks and punches and all that. And in the Galwan case, nothing ever came out of it. The two had to disengage. And in terms of the peacekeeping operation, like I said, it was a massive disaster with people accusing the Chinese troops of running away. So this is so people could take you and I, Sanjay, and put us in a battlefield with the best equipment and night vision goggles and all that. I'm sorry, but when I see the opposition army advancing, I'm getting the hell out of there, right? My job is military affairs and strategy in the classroom. I'm not
Mm.
going to stand, and that's the difference between theory and practice. The
Mm.
Chinese now have great theory, great tech, great resources, and all that. But the real winner and loser of a war is decided by whose soldier pisses their pants first. in the battlefield and runs away, you know.
That's a good idea.
So these things don't really matter as much as we think in a
Mm.
war. It's human emotions like courage, initiative, all of that is what still determines the winner and loser.
But what if Chinese sixth generation fighters, to be truly sixth generation as they claim them to be, versus a fourth gen fighter? But that's clearly an advantage. I mean, you don't even have to piss your pants. You can, it's beyond visual range. You can just destroy them out of thin air, and nobody will know that you were even there. If
Yeah,
you if you
so
have
but
such a technical advantage, such a gap in technology, will that be enough? I think that would be enough, right, for the most part.
So, in case of a singular one versus one, fourth generation versus sixth generation, yes. But number one, we don't know what the quality of the pilot is going to
Mm.
be. We don't know what the quality of the air doctrine is going to be. So I'll give you an example. When we saw the Russia-Ukraine war, the first 4 or 5 months, if you remember, Russia suffered very, very heavy aerial losses. The Russian Air Force lost many of their advanced fighter jets and their senior skilled
Su
pilots.
34s mainly. Yeah, a lot
Yeah,
of Su 34s went out.
yeah, right. And the reason for that is not because of the shortcoming of the craft itself. It was the shortcoming of the doctrine. Very poor communication, very poor strategic planning, very poor, coordination between the various different agencies. So some of the planes were flying far too low than they were actually supposed to, so they got taken out easily. Some never actually fulfilled their purposes because the coordination was so poor. So
You mean
look,
that they came back with weapons intact without deploying?
yeah. In some cases, and in some
Mm.
cases, they got blown out. So my point
Mm.
is that the management, the communication, the doctrine, all of
Mm.
that is more important than the level of technology
Mm.
itself. I mean, let's face it, right? If American jets can't win a fight against Afghan goat farmers, then there's no point in determining the outcome of India and China by looking at what Indian jets and Chinese jets can do to each other. That's a very, very small part of the actual engagement, and it will be far more symbolic than meaningful.
In a case of boots on the ground, who do you think have the best deployment record?
Okay, so the thing is now on the Himalayan side, right? So in the 1962 war,
Mm.
China, China completely sort of dominated India in the
Mm.
1962 war
This happened over what territory? I mean, is it a
over Tibet,
territorial dispute? Over Tibet. Okay.
right? Over India, China accusing India of helping Tibet a bit too much, and then Arunachal Pradesh, which they called Aksai Chin, and all that, right? So when it comes to a modern day scenario like that, and I'm just sharing with you what I've heard from the Indian defense establishment, right? India has now mined all those slopes.
Mm.
So a large Chinese invasion, land invasion, like what happened in 1962 now, is not going to be possible. These guys would just be walking into their own death.
Mm. How can
And
you mine such a large area?
yeah, so well, they've had what 60
So many
years,
years. Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
So many.
at this point. So and once again, this is what I've heard from Indian defense analysts,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
Do I have actual photographic evidence and all that? No. This is what I've heard the Indian security community discuss. So that's one, right? So a land invasion from that avenue is no longer going to be viable. Now, if you look at an air invasion, there's another problem. India is lower, then you have the Himalaya, China is higher. India can take off much heavier aircraft and all that than China can. Because at that high altitude, there's a limit over the size of the tonnage of the aircraft that you can take off the ground.
Mm. Mm.
So even there, China is not going to be able to mobilize
Mm.
a large part of its larger fleet. So it's going to have to be intercontinental ballistic missiles, jets that actually stay in Chinese territory and then fire at long range targets and things like that. A ground invasion will not be in China's interests.
What about aircraft carriers? They currently have about three, right?
Yeah, China has also, incidentally, at this conference that I was in Shanghai last month, one of the Chinese admirals there was like, by 2027 at least, China should introduce an aircraft carrier into the Indian Ocean.
Mm.
Now, that the Indians might consider to be a red line. If the
Mm.
Chinese do that, that might be considered a red line. See, the Chinese are also in a very difficult position because they have what's known as the Malacca dilemma. The Malacca Strait is a small gap from which Southeast Asia can be joined up with the subcontinent and things like that. So when the Cholas basically went in and ransacked Southeast Asian kingdoms and planted their flag and all that, it was the
True,
it was
Malacca.
this that they took advantage of, where the Southeast Asian armed navies were all gathered up at the Strait of Malacca,
Mm.
expecting the Chola navy to come.
Mm.
But the Cholas, because they had very advanced maritime technology, they went around, they did the long path that even the Chinese today don't want to make. They made the
Mm.
long path and they went in and they ambushed those guys
From
from
behind.
the back.
Mm.
And they ransacked anyway. So that's all for another conversation. So China is worried that if there's a war and India closes off or manages to blockade off the Malacca Strait, then China will be in big trouble. So that's a specific choke point that
Why
it's
can't they
easy.
take the long path given today's technology and capabilities?
The cost, the time, all of that would be significantly higher, very, very, significantly higher. And you can take a small volume there for military purposes, like the Cholas did, but
Mm.
you cannot facilitate an entire global trade chain like that.
What
So,
about the submarines?
yeah, but how much trade can you actually
Ah, you
conduct?
mean you're talking about trade? If that happens, the Indians will block Malacca, so the trade won't happen. Okay,
They're,
okay, I
yeah,
got it.
they're
Yeah.
worried that both the military and a trade blockade
Mm.
can easily be imposed by rival powers.
Mm.
That's essentially the Malacca dilemma. So
Mm.
China is also looking to project power into the Indian Ocean as soon as possible, naval power. But in terms of naval engagements, once again, see, I don't see naval engagements between India and China happening with the same, I can't predict that with the same probability of a terrestrial war, because they actually have contested territories like
Mm.
Arunachal Pradesh. China has a part of Kashmir that China claims as its own,
Mm.
right? So
From India or Pakistan?
Kashmir right now, there's a place which India exercises jurisdiction over. There's a place that Pakistan exercises jurisdiction over, and there's a place that China
Mm.
exercises jurisdiction over.
Mm. So if they introduce an aircraft carrier to the Indian Ocean, they will be competing against both US as well as Indians and UK, United Kingdom as well.
I mean, yeah, but let's face it, right? Nobody really cares about the British Navy at this point. No offense, but they are not
Mm.
geopolitical players.
Mm.
As in the geopolitical players are the ones who make their own decisions. uh, Britain, so the UK's nuclear button, for instance, many people make a claim that because of the Trident program, that the actual red button for British nuclear weapons is in Washington. And
Mm.
what that basically means is that countries like France and the United Kingdom, they might be permanent members of the Security Council, but they do not have strategic autonomy, while
Mm.
India and China and the United States have strategic autonomy. They
And
have
Russia?
no boss upstairs.
And Russia, maybe?
Yeah, Russia,
Mm.
right? All these nations have, they don't have someone above
Mm.
them whom you need
Mm.
to get a green light from.
So America basically did the NATO treaty to get those guys under their belt.
Yeah, I mean, and look at how it's shaping up now, right? Now,
Mm.
when the United States actually puts its foot down and says, hey, we are going to cut off your funding unless you guys contribute something as well. NATO can squabble and bicker and complain and all that, but ultimately it's quite clear where the actual power is.
Mm. Mm. Okay, so let's come back to the main topic now again. So, how do you think Sri Lanka should play this? What kind of news you think you would assume that we might hear apart from the Chinese vessels and all? What kind of aid or what kind of support that they could give us?
I mean, so one good thing would be Chinese assurance that if any debt structuring issues come up in the future, that China will be quite eager and
Isn't that been
proactive.
finalized already?
So the thing is, this will not be the last time we need to pay back our debts, and this will not be the last time there's controversy about how we pay back our debts either. Let's be realistic, right? A small country like us, which, as we've discussed in previous conversation, which does not have any income generating power, debt will always be something that we need to navigate around, whether we like it or not, right? So Chinese assurance in debt restructuring, if we were to need it, that would be good. Chinese assurance that China will not contribute to escalating things between India and China is one. So, for example, they now know that the Indians are making a big deal about the research vessels. And as you pointed out, now that they know that it's a big deal, why can't they just back off? If they do so, it would be a magnanimous gesture and it would actually help Sri Lanka China relations, right? See, we've got to remember that when we had the rubber rice pact and all that back in the old days, at a certain point of time when China was finding it difficult to manufacture enough rice, China used to import rice from other countries like Vietnam and Thailand just to export it to Sri Lanka to keep up their obligations under the rubber rice pact.
Mm.
Right. So even though China will never be like a family member whom you can depend on for a crisis the way that we can depend on India,
Mm.
we can always count on China to act professionally
Mm.
and to keep up with certain obligations and commitments that are emphasized. So, if they take a magnanimous approach to this, where they say, okay, fine, you guys can do whatever you want. If you guys want to be aligned with India for now, we understand. That would be the best case scenario. China magnanimously taking a step back and allowing a natural, uh, allowing us to exploit India's growth without preventing us from being able to do that.
Let's hope that happens, or something quite close to that.
Well, I
That's
mean,
the
if it
best case.
doesn't, our podcast episodes, the titles are going to keep getting increasingly pessimistic, right? So we better hope that happens.
Yes, of course. So, is that all that we have to cover here for today's episode? Is there anything else that I missed?
So I think another thing that would be useful for our audience is also a general conversation on the Belt and Road Initiative itself and why it's so important for them. So just like how each country has a certain civilizational policy and they
Mm.
identify certain components, Sri Lanka is important for China because we are an integral part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, many people say, oh, strategic location, blah, blah, blah. But what do they actually mean by that?
Mm.
What they mean by that is for China's BRI that was announced in 2013 and that currently spans, I think, something like 140 countries or something like that, we are an integral part of that
Mm.
chain,
Mm.
which is what they want from us.
Mm.
We also need to understand that we are one among many.
Mm.
we can never expect our relationship with China to be as special as our relationship with India, because for India, we are legitimately their closest maritime neighbor. No other country is as close to India on a maritime level as we are. So there's a genuine connection there, and there's a genuine civilizational connection where, whether it's the Ramayana, whether it's the Ashokan kingdom, whether it's Buddhism and Hinduism and all that, there, regardless, even if you wipe out modern economics and modern politics, there will be a cohesive relationship there. Whereas with China, it's modern politics that's largely dictating China's relationship with us. It's the modern day stuff that actually, so that's important for us to understand.
Okay. Okay. I think. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, but your camera's like
Yeah.
blurry.
Yeah. Okay. I think I got a
Okay, yeah.
call there. Okay. Okay. So given that we hope that our delegation can negotiate up to the point where they are being professional as well as I mean, compromising in a way that would not hurt our relationship with India as well as strengthening our relationship with China. Apart from that, what kind of benefits we can get out from China? I mean, what do you think? The technology
Oh my God.
transfers.
Oh yeah.
What?
So
Yeah.
technology transfers, infrastructure development, China's specialty. China's specialty is being able to go into a poorer country, throw a lot of money around for infrastructure, building bridges, building roads, building factories. It's almost the old British colonial model. I mean, not that we're going to start accusing China of being a colonial power and all that, but they are very good at investing money and encouraging local governments to make these huge infrastructure projects. Sometimes they turn into a bad thing, but sometimes they can also be a very good
But
thing.
I
So,
mean, there are accusations towards them that they have nurtured a corruption culture just to get those projects built, to facilitate the Belt and Road Initiative by bribing our politicians. I mean, yeah, it's bad on our side, but they kind of added fuel to the fire, didn't they?
yeah, see, the thing is, poorer countries like us, the Asian countries in the developing world, the African, particularly sub Saharan African countries in the developing world, and all that, whenever somebody comes in to invest a large amount of money in us, we blame them for us being corrupt. This is what the developing world does to American
Perfect.
corporations when they're like, oh, you guys came in here and you bribed all the officials and you bought over power and you encouraged despotic dictators and all that. And this is the same accusation against the Chinese as well. So, this is the accusation that the rich make against any poor nation who comes in there to pump a lot of money in. So I would much rather blame the local countries rather than the people who are investing money. Because I see this almost like a widespread disease where every African and every Asian country is more than happy to blame the West and China for nurturing corruption when they forget that this is what you will do no matter who comes in with money. This is their standard accusation against anybody who comes in ready to invest a large sum of money, because you need to swallow up that money and you need somebody to blame after it's been swallowed up.
So it's standard practice for those countries, the leaders as well as the public.
Yeah, so let's blame the people who've made it a standard practice rather than the person who's actually giving you money.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. Okay. So I think we have discussed most of the aspects surrounding Sri Lanka and China relationship, but we don't know the exact details of this meetup. We'll have to wait for the press release, joint press release by the presidents of both countries. Once that happened, we could get a better understanding of what actually went down and what are the agreements and the disagreements between the countries. So with that, we will leave room for another one next week. Hopefully, we could get more details on that and discuss how it's actually going to play down in the next 1 to 10 years or so.
Yeah.
So,
I also
yeah.
have a small question for your audience.
Yes, please.
Do you guys feel that this trip is publicized anywhere nearly as much as the India trip? I feel like the India trip had so much coverage and there was so much discussion and debate over what was going to happen, what should happen, what's at stake, what are the various things that will come under discussion, the trade agreement, the surveillance issue, security concerns, blah, blah, blah. Whereas here it almost feels like there's very little conversation even over what's at stake. All the articles and all that are like, yeah, he's going to China, but there almost seems to be a, I wouldn't say a hushed sort of feeling, but it does feel like there's almost a deliberate quietness about it. And I wonder what your audience has to say about that, whether they felt it or not.
Okay, so I'm not going to answer that. It's for you guys. So why don't you just comment? If you are here up to this point watching this, then you must have an answer. So let's hear it. Okay, thanks, Nilan. So we'll see you next week, hopefully, with more information about this issue,
As always.
as well as anything else that might pop on our radar. Okay, take care, buddy.